The next tutorial on the Japanese National Study for HSC history students, but it could be useful for any students who are studying Japan during this particular period. We're going to skip ahead in the curriculum and in the syllabus to this next section, which is going to be focusing on Japanese foreign policy. We are going to come back to what is happening and the forces of the kind of Showa period domestically in Japan in the next tutorial. But before we move on to that, we first need to understand this kind of crucial period from 1930 to 1933 in which Japanese foreign policy really starts to come to the fore. We know, and if you should have watched already the Great Depression video, which forms the beginning of this kind of Showa restoration. And that is kind of what we're going to get into the next tutorial. But before we get to that Showa restoration, we first need to understand the critical events that shape Japanese foreign policy from 1930 to 1933. You can see below there is a kind of good summary of what is happening in the period. So we see Japanese delegates at the London Naval Agreement. This is the extension from what we see in the Washington on the left there. We then see skirmishes, conflicts, this concept of a false flag I'm going to be talking about in today's tutorial as well. And then finally, the Japanese delegates walking out of the then League of Nations. So let's get into it. So our inquiry question for today is, how did militarism develop during the Showa period? And that's going to be a kind of a core focus over the next couple of tutorials. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on today is, how do the events in China impact on the growth of militarism and nationalism in Japan? And it really kind of intensifies this period as we see, if we look back at that cartoon that we looked at last tutorial, the militarists dragging the bureaucrats, dragging the zaibatsu into a conflict, into China. This is a timeline of the period. It's only 3 years, but there are many key events that you need to make sure that you have a good understanding of. So in 1930, it opens with the London Naval Conference. We're going to talk about that. We then see, again, an assassination attempt. We already have one PM who was assassinated, Harakei. And so we're going to see another assassination attempt. We're going to see a series of, attempted coups. We then see in 18th of September, officers of the Kwangtung Army are going to attack a railroad and they blame it on the Chinese. This is known as the Manchurian incident. We're going to talk about that in quite a bit of detail. And then we have a series of kind of skirmishes, infighting, political coups, assassinations, until we get to the establishment of the state of Manchuria, which is the puppet state. It's called Manchukuo. And then we have the May the 15th incident, which we talked about in the last tutorial. So if you're not unsure what happens on May the 15th, you need to make sure that you go and review that, because that is going to be the end of Tsuyoshi Inukai. He is assassinated, and that is the end of the party cabinets. And then it finally culminates with Japan leaving the League of Nations and the Treaty of Tanggu on 31st of May 1933. So let's get into the events. So we first open the 1930s with the London Naval Conference. Around the outside of that circle, you can see the kind of context which is shaping what is happening in the London Naval Conference. So if you remember from our earlier tutorials, we looked at the Washington Naval Conference. This stipulates that Japan's comparative naval tonnage should be 553, with Japan getting the 3. UK should have 5, US should have 5, but it did not restrict submarines. Remember that the Japanese delegation at Washington Naval Conference accepts this treaty, but the militarists back home are very, very angered by it. They believe that it's putting a limitation on Japanese power. It believes that it's unfair. Why do US and UK get more? And why are we, still regarded as a second-tier nation, which is going to be an important element in kind of Japanese thinking at the time. We then see as well, during the same period, a rise in militarist sentiment. We're going to see the Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Kato Kanji, he sought to voice concerns to Hirohito during the period. His request, he became involved in negotiations, but he was blocked by the Grand Chamberlain. Okay, he wanted Hirohito to go to the London Naval Conference and voice his concerns, take an active role in politics. But Hirohito did not see him. US and Japanese relations had also very much worsened during the period. In 1924, US signed the 1924 Immigration Act, which stops Japanese immigration to the US. Remember, if we looked at in the survey, we looked at the Gentleman's Agreement, which stipulated that if Japan had put some limitations on Japanese immigration, that they would allow free flow of people, and they would allow the schools to continue to be integrated. This is now stopped. In 1924, there is no more Japanese immigration to America. And during this 1920s period, Japan had kind of sought to flex its military capability. So those 4 points around the outside of what's happening in the middle forms the context of what these delegates and diplomats are bringing to the London Naval Conference. So the Masato government, announced the goal to increase the Japanese ratio from 60 to 70. So they proposed a new ratio of 10-10-7. Japan is unsuccessful. Once again, they go to an international conference. They try to put forward their position. Again, is unsuccessful. This has happened now multiple times. This has happened at the Treaty of Versailles, the Washington Naval Conference, and now the London Naval Conference. Militarists, again, furious. So we see a lot of repetition here. They saw it as a direct limitation of their power. Prime Minister Hamaguchi was able to increase its capacity in certain categories of warships, but not others. So that's an important thing to note. They did have some leniency towards certain categories, but some were still limited. So Hamaguchi met with Emperor Hirohito to get his approval for the treaty to be signed. These actions sparked intense militarist reaction. They believed that the Grand Chamberlain to be corrupt, and he was serving the interests of the democratic people. They believed the emperor was being led astray by politicians and bureaucracy, and they believed that the Diet, the House of Representatives in Japan, was intervening in military affairs and decreasing the budget by 210 million yen. So what we have here is the militarists, they blame the bureaucracy, they blame the constitutional framework that the emperor has to work within. They never blame the emperor. They are seeking to kind of restore the emperor in this kind of Showa restoration. They blame everyone around the emperor because they think that the emperor is serving the interests, always has the interests of the people. Remember, he is also very much linked to Shinto religion. And so that's an important thing to know, that he is, a divine being. And so they blame all the different elements of the Meiji constitution around him, which leads to this kind of capitulation of that. So this is going to contribute to the assassination of Hamaguchi on May 15th, 1932. The anti-faction, or fleet wing is going to take control of the Navy over the following years, and the treaty weakened the legitimacy of the Masato and party rule in general. And so that's what we're going to see in 1932 with the collapse of the party cabinets. So important to note there, guys, is the anti-treaty faction, called Fleet Wing. And we're going to be talking about that in a later tutorial about the different factions that develop within the Navy and the Army. These are the types of slogans that the militarists tend to use during this period. You might want to pause here and just have a read through. I've already mentioned one of them, which is key, the Showa Restoration. And this is the call for the emperor to rule himself, so not have a constitutional monarchy anymore, because they believed that they were freeing him from the bureaucracy, from the politicians, from all the red tape that surrounded the government. And we're going to be talking about this later on when we talk about foreign policy in a little bit more detail, but we get the desire to create what is known as a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, in which they kind of liberate and unite the Asian economies and Asian nations, and they believe that this will free them from Western colonial powers. This is the kind of vision of a united Asia that Japan is seeking to develop. And this, whilst it sounds kind of very altruistic, very positive, this kind of unifying of different Asian nations, it is definitely to try and reinforce Japanese control. And Japan would put themselves as leaders of this greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And we can see there are a few more about kind of the different types of views that were developing during this 1930s period. And this is really intensified very much by the Great Depression as well, which we would have looked at in the last tutorial. So what happens? So Prime Minister Habaguchi was assassinated for his role in the acceptance and negotiation through the Diet, shot by right-wing youth in November of 1930. In Feb and March 1932, former Prime Minister and Mitsu Zaibatsu were murdered by members of the League of Blood. And from March to October, there were also threats of coups in the military. So you can see there, this is this secret society called the League of Blood who are carrying out these assassination attempts. So we're going to see, increasing kind of conflict. Then we have in China at the same period of time as we have this man, Ishiwara Kanji. He is the Kwangtung Operations Officer from 1929 to 1932, and he is really kind of stirring this nationalism in China. He believed that the cataclysmic final war loomed inevitably between Japan and the US. He is bound to be fighting a war with the US. This is what he thinks is Japanese destiny. So he advocates very much for the expansion to China, these fertile plains, to lessen population pressure, boost agricultural production, and solve the agrarian poverty. This is particularly resonant when we see during the Great Depression, massive, deflation, poverty becomes hugely problematic. People don't have access to food anymore. We see very poor harvests. We have a tsunami that hits Japan as well. So all of these messages are really going to become more and more supportive when the Great Depression hits. And he seeks to create a state based on the principles of social equality, loyal to the state, rather than this capitalistic profit-seeking, which, as we know, the key group supporting that is the Zaibatsu. And so he is very much against the Zaibatsu. So what are their goals? What are they seeking to do? So we already remember from looking at the earlier survey about some of Japan's early expansionist desires. In World War I, they had issued the 21 demands to China, of which only 15 were actually accepted. The last group, Group 6, as we know, was not accepted, which would seek to make China into what can be referred to as a puppet state, with Japan pretty much controlling the actions of China. It would put, legislative power, it would put them in control of the police, it would give them economic power. That Group 6 of the demands is not accepted. However, 15 demands are accepted, which pretty much gives them control over Shandong. Then, in 1919, the Shandong Peninsula is formally given to Japan, which creates a huge uproar in China. This is now, Japanese control. So this is decided by the Western nations at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, and it is seen that Japan won this land, which was originally controlled by the Germans, and so they deserve it. So they also have an increasing demand to become a major world power. So we see that in the Treaty of Versailles, trying to expand their territorial influence, and then also in the Washington Naval Conference, where they are seeking to expand their military capability. And we get this concern that if they didn't acquire more living space for their citizens, they are not going to be able to sustain themselves as a modern state. So that is why they become involved in the Russian Civil War and launch the Siberian expedition. We then see Korea becoming a protectorate and then having formal control in 1910. So this is the movement towards a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere that we see developing in this early period. Then next, we see, so the Japanese War Party. This is a group in the government that really kind of want, and militarists, who want to push towards war. They demand that occupation of Manchuria and Mongolia, is the first step in Japan's conquest of the whole of Asia. This view is expressed in the Tanaka Memorial, which we're not going to look at because it's not necessarily clear whether this is a accurate historical document. It's believed that it was developed by the Chinese to kind of embarrass the Japanese diplomatically, but it gives a really good representation of Japanese foreign policy in 1927, but it has kind of been disregarded as historians as a fake. So the memorial, what it says is, It urged Japan to abandon the promise it had given in 1922 at Washington, okay, and to honor Japanese sovereignty, to seek to protect the nation. So they really kind of advocate for this Japanese needs first, and that they urgently required raw materials and living space for their growing population. So that is what we're going to see, okay? And we see this already in the Russo-Japanese War as well. So during this period, okay, they had 80% of Japan's total investments had gone into Manchuria after they win this during the Russo-Japanese War. The Manchuria is, partly controlled by a Japanese warlord called Zhang Jolin, and we know from looking at earlier tutorials that in 1928 he is assassinated by the Chinese military because they fear that he is going to side with the nationalist group. So you can see here, this is just another map to show you the control that Japan has over the period, over the area. Sorry, they're going to take control of these key railways. Okay, they're going to take control of Korea as a result. That is going to form a protectorate in 1905, and then formally a part of the Japanese Empire in 1910. So it's an important step forward, okay, into incorporating that as a part of the empire. And this just summarizes the point here, okay? So you can see that this northern province, okay, up here, okay, originally, okay, was under control of Zhang Jolin, but they feared that he would be incorporated into the Kuomintang. Okay, these blue areas you can see here are controlled by the Kuomintang, this nationalist group of the Chinese political system. And they fear that, if Chiang Kai-shek could unify all of China, that they would provide a real threat to Japanese interests in the area. So they assassinate him to stop Chiang's northern expedition, okay, and it halts in Jinan, okay, in Shandong, okay. So Jinan, okay, is just this area here, okay. So instead of expanding north, okay, into Manchuria, they stop there. So what happens, okay? What is the Manchurian crisis that really sparks in 1931? So on 18th of September 1931, a group of Japanese officers in the Kuomintang army acted upon their own initiative and the militarist desires, all of these things about a Japanese first policy, all of these ideas about expanding into Manchuria, that this was the first step in the greater East Asian coast prosperity sphere, that they needed to take action, okay, in order to, solve the issues on the home front, like the Great Depression and all the economic, aftermath that happened as well. They attack a stretch of the Manchurian railway at Mukden. So it's also called the Mukden incident, and they blame it on Chinese saboteurs. You can see the officers who are involved there. They were part of the pro-war party in Tokyo, and they appealed to the government to authorize the punishment of the Chinese. So they blame this on the Chinese, and they say, look, the Chinese have attacked our railway. Now we need to have some sort of repercussions. So this is what's called a false flag. So this is, they are, attacking their own railway and then blaming it on another nation in order to, plant a false flag, okay, in order for them to have, justification to then launch a reprisal attack on the enemy. So this is what they do. Without waiting for a response, okay, the Kuomintang army launched a full-scale sweep of Manchuria, and it results in a full military occupation in about 6 months, okay? So there is a small skirmish that happens at Mukden, and then that launches into a much larger invasion of all of Manchuria and full military occupation within 6 months. The government does not authorize this attack. There is no word from Tokyo to give them the authorization to go and attack Manchuria. The foreign minister, Shidehara, told the Kuomintang to refrain from further military action, but Ishihara's group ignored the order. So they're now ignoring orders from high political ministers. They're now, no longer under control of what's happening in Tokyo. The prime minister at the time refused to declare war and only referred to the conflict as an incident, never as a war. The military commander in Korea, he sends more troops to support, the army, refused to de-escalate the conflict, he doesn't have authorization to do this either. So we see militarist commanders acting upon their own volition to do what they think is in the best interest of Japan and really fuel this growing militarism. So prime minister, he's going to resign. Tsuyoshi is going to inherit the issue. Our new prime minister, he's not going to be around for long because he's going to get assassinated. And so despite the initial hesitation, the Japanese government, seeking to regain kind of control of the army because it looks like this army is just doing whatever they want, They sanction the takeover. They defend their actions against international protests, okay, and the League of Nations investigations. So the League of Nations are going to send a committee out to investigate the validity of the accusations that are being made about Japanese aggression in the area and whether this is legal. And there's also a huge call for Japan to end their militarist expansionist ways by the Western nations. And so what they're going to do, okay, once they get control of Manchuria in 1931, they're now going to form it into what is known as a puppet state. So a puppet state is whereby the nation, they put in charge a leader who is going to be loyal to them, but the majority of the control of that particular state is controlled by Japan. So they're going to put someone who they can have a lot of sway over, but also someone who appears in all intents and purposes to be a Chinese leader. So they put in charge of this Puyi, the last emperor of the Manchu dynasty, which ends in the early 20th century. And so they declare it to be an independent Chinese nation. Okay, this is a vassal state. Okay, fueled the economy, laid the platform for further expansion into China. So all of the natural resources that they gain in Manchukuo are really vital for fueling Japanese economic recovery from the Great Depression and really, leading to their development in the lead up to World War II. We then see a series of skirmishes in 1932. Chiang Kai-shek appeals to the League of Nations. Okay, they are going to them saying, please intervene, please give us troops, please help to stop the Japanese expansion. League of Nations is unwilling and also somewhat unable to act during this time. Remember, this is the time of the Great Depression. Nations are looking inward at their own economies, not looking at external issues. So Japanese actions are condemned, but no direct action is actually undertaken. And so we're going to see a committee being formed, okay, and that leads the findings of that committee. Japan just leaves the League of Nations. They say we don't justify the value of this at anymore. So seeking to defend Chinese sovereignty, Chiang ordered the Shanghai garrison commander, you can see him there, Sai Ting-kai, to launch a counterattack between January to March 1932. The nationalist soldiers are quite, at least these soldiers are quite capable, and so they do put up a bit of resistance. We're going to see 20,000 troops to support the launch naval bombardment in Shanghai. Okay, 15,000 of the Chinese defenders are killed, okay, compared to only 2,000. So the Chinese are really fighting to every man in order to defend Shanghai. So Shanghai remains under Japanese occupation, okay, in terms of structure which established combined Sino-Japanese administration. Okay, although this is pretty much dominated by the Japanese. So the Chinese during this time are really fighting for their sovereignty, which is a key principle of the nationalist policy in Japan during this period. And so collaborators were hated by Chinese. Anyone who worked with the Japanese was really kind of marginalized from society. They're despised by the Japanese, and Chiang had little focus on removing kind of Japanese control. His main focus of the nationalists, okay, whilst it was about sovereignty, he thinks that the main problem in China is that of communism under Mao Zedong in the south of China. He is going to allow the Japanese to continue kind of advancing and have this kind of administration over Manchukuo and over Shanghai, because his priorities are looking at the problem to the south in the communists. And so this conflict or this skirmish, okay, ends in what's known as the Treaty of Tanggu. And so they come to an agreement, and they establish a demilitarized zone, a DMZ, stretching 65 miles south of the Great Wall, extending from Beijing to Tianjin, with the Great Wall to be under Japanese control. And you might think, okay, well, why is that important? Why are we thinking about the Great Wall, okay, during like a modern conflict, okay? But it's a symbolic thing. Remember, if you think back to your earlier history days, the Great Wall is this great, defensive perimeter, which is meant to stop the Mongols from attacking China. Now this is under control of Japan. It's an important symbolic representation of Japan is now within the walls. They are inside of China. They are not on the outside anymore. GMD forces are barred from entering the DMZ, and the DMZ is controlled by Japanese Peace Corps. And you can see here, this is in the province of Jehol, okay? And you can see here, this is the DMZ that we see in that shaded color, which stretches across this particular area. So we see a DMZ being created in this area. Manchuria is going to fall under all of Japanese control. Korea is already under Japanese control. Taiwan is already under Japanese control. And we have the Japan itself as well as the Salican Islands, which they gained during the Russo-Japanese War. So Japan has expanded into all these areas, okay, by 1933. So the Treaty of Tanggu marks the acceptance by the GMD of Manchukuo and Japanese control of northern China. As I said to you before, Chiang Kai-shek is more concerned with the communists in China as opposed to the Japanese threat in the north, okay? Chiang, what he wants to do is he trades space to buy time. He thinks, let's give in to the Japanese at this period, fight the communists, put down the communists, and then we will have the forces necessary and the whole of China's backing us in order to then fight the Japanese. But that kind of fails for him. So this approach, okay, allowed time for the GMD, okay, led to a lack of support broadly within its own ranks. The nationalists, okay, start to, have some problems. Okay, there's a troop uprising in Fujian. Okay, criticized Chiang for failing to confront. Further damage came in 1934 to 1935 when Japanese troops spread into 6 northern provinces. Okay, he stuck to his policy, withdrew GM forces from Beijing and accepted the newly occupied provinces to be recognized as autonomous regions administered by pro-Japanese officials. So he is going to continue pulling out of northern China to focus on fighting the communists. How does the League of Nations react? I already mentioned that they are going to have international condemnation, but really do nothing. So Japanese delegates such as Prince Seoji, okay, which is a member of the Genro, saw it as an opportunity to have a voice in international affairs. This is initially when they joined the League of Nations. The League of Nations, okay, send a committee out to Manchuria to investigate what is happening in Mukden and with the attack on the railway. They're going to do this, okay, a year after the attack at Mukden. So things are quite delayed in actual action from the League of Nations. Their findings are handed down in what is known as the Lytton Report. This is prepared by Lord Lytton from Britain. And you can see the findings there. So both parties are found guilty. They blame the Chinese for their anti-Japanese propaganda and refusal to compromise, but they brand Japan as the aggressor. They declare that the puppet state of Manchukuo with its emperor Puyi is illegitimate, and they called for a multilateral conference to demilitarize the entire region. Okay, you can see here, this is how Bernard Partridge in Punch magazine represents the findings of the Lytton Report. We see this old maid, okay, who is represented the League of Nations, okay, telling off the naughty dog, who is Japan, for grabbing the bone. You can see here and saying the command courteous. League of Nations says, good dog, drop it now. Okay, the dog is obviously not going to drop it. Japan is not going to give up Manchuria. Why would they? This is such a weak response by the League of Nations. And so what do they do? They walk out. So this is another cartoon. This is from now David Lowe, very famous British cartoonist. So in response to the findings of the Lytton Report, Japan is going to leave. It hoped that the findings wouldn't be enforced, okay, upon non-member states, okay? And so the League of Nations is referred to as a doormat, something you can just walk over. Something that you can see there, the paper says the honor of nations, okay? Japan has kind of scribbled it out, and they're continuing to save face, continuing to kind of prop up the League of Nations, even though it has no actual spine, it has no backing, it has no strength to stand up to Japan, and simply, the League of Nations kind of bows down to Japan and to, militarism. So that is initial introduction into the, Japanese foreign policy. What we're going to look at in the next period is part 2, where we're going to see rising tensions and expansionist desires from 1933 to 1937. So what you need to do is, I recommend that you go back and have a look at this key inquiry question. Think about now what you've learned in regards to, okay, how do we see this growing move towards militarism? And what do we see in China, especially during 1931? What impact does this have on really driving militarism and nationalism and increasing this support for a Showa restoration? I'll see you in the next tutorial.